Okay, Vijaya Nagarajan, is that
Yep,
more or less
that's
right?
right. Yeah.
Teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at University of San Francisco. She has received numerous awards. She's also active in the environmental movement. She's the co-founder of the Recovery of the Commons Project and the Institute for the Study of Natural Cultural Resources. Her book, Feeding 1,000 Souls, was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. As I said at the beginning, we had Vijaya presenting when she was writing the book, and we were all amazed by the images and the stories about the Kolam. And at the personal level, I have been in South India, and I was an idiot. I saw every morning, I saw the women painting the Kolam in front of their homes, and I just thought it was weird. I didn't take pictures. Of course, now 10 years later, I'm not sure if it is as common as it was in the old days. Anyway, the floor is yours. I'm going to stop my video to give you maximum bandwidth, okay?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Piero. I just want to first begin by thanking you, just giving you a huge thank you for your incredible love of the Kolam over these many years. And I remember your, first inviting me to University of San Francisco, my own university, but your series there, I think it was 2012. And I'd only given a couple of little talks on the math chapter. And I was just figuring it out, and I wasn't sure where I was going, and just preparing that talk for you for the series at USF. And then, it was sort of a coming together for me of many threads. And also then you invited me to do Stanford, and then the, laser in Berkeley too. So, and you've been pushing me all these years, like, when are you getting the book done? So I just want to thank you for.
And let me tell you, you had an influence on the programming of the lasers.
Oh.
Because before your talk, there were very few talks that were so outside the mainstream science and mainstream art. And the Kolam is sort of in between, right?
Yeah.
Anthropological, theological, and so on.
Yeah.
So you really indirectly, you push me to go beyond, to start thinking about these disciplines that, they're not easy to categorize. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I didn't know that, so that's interesting. Yeah, but I just wanted to thank you because you're, when we work in these fields that may not seem to touch each other, initially, you feel very alone. And so it's really helpful to have colleagues and, friends and people that see the vision of what you're seeing. And so I just want to thank you, Piero, for that. You were one of my most important for this math chapter. So I want to just show the book quickly. It's called Feeding 1,000 Souls. And as Piero said, it's about the Kolam, a women's ritual art tradition in South India. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can begin. Here we go. Move this over. Okay, there we go. This is a project that began in some ways, the seeds of it came into being 50 years ago when I was 9 years old and went back from America, back to India. I was born in a small village called Yanangudi in Thanjavur district in Tamil Nadu in southern India along the Kaveri River, which is like one of the Nile, like the equivalent of the Nile River in South India, one of the most abundant sort of riverine delta plains in the world. And so that's one of the reasons why this is made out of rice flour, because it comes out of a field of rice fields, like you've seen pictures of Bali with rice fields stretching to the horizon. That's how Tamil Nadu is, and especially the place where I was from. So let me go to the next slide. So the Kolam is a Tamil word, and it means beauty, form, play, disguise, and ritual design. And you'll see these themes coming through in my talk. And so this is just a very brief kind of talk about the book and about this work, which keeps unfolding in many ways. And I don't know, this is a festival of the Pongal, which happens in mid-January. And that's if you want to see the Kolam in South India, this is the time to go from mid-December to mid-January. It's when it's abundant, and you can see this is one of the highlights for the 3-day festival. And some of you might have caught this, that the Kolam recently came on the international stage, surprisingly, when Kamala Harris became, vice president. Within the week before and the week after, in her grandfather's ancestral village, which was 10 miles or 20 miles from where I was born, and my own family's ancestral village, they celebrated her victory and her potential victory with making kolams all through their village, which it was in the Guardian, it was, in the news all over the world. And so friends sent me that, and I thought I was very delighted that for the first time the Kolam is getting some international attention in the field of politics, which was very surprising. So this is Tamil Nadu, this is South India. And so I traveled a lot in Tamil Nadu to do my research over the last 25 years. In Tanjavur district, this is near where I was born, and you see the rich river valleys. And so I went to all these different cities and also many, many more throughout my research. What's interesting about the Kolam is the women's ritual art design tradition in Hinduism in particular is not just limited to Tamil Nadu. So it's important to know that this is a practice that's throughout India. And these are some of the few names that are throughout India. So you have the Mandana in Rajasthan, Satya in Gujarat, Rangoli in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Karnataka. You have the Mugu in Andhra Pradesh, the Chitta in Orissa, and Alpana in Bengal. And then of course the Kolam in Tamil Nadu. So there's been several little books on these different regional traditions, but this book on the Kolam is really the first kind of in-depth, ethnographic and anthropological and literary and mathematical and design and ecological exploration of this tradition, which is one of the reasons why it took me so long to finish the book, because I had to learn many different fields in order to interpret the Kolam. And I want to just set the context that this is not isolated just in India. You have this kind of global ephemeral ritual art designs. Many of you are familiar with the sand mandalas in Tibet. There's also the Sona ritual, which also has some mathematics in it in Angola. And then, of course, we're familiar with the sand paintings among the Navajo. And then you might not be familiar with this. There is an English practice native to England and Wales called combs or chalks that I have photographs from the 1930s in folklore journals where women were practicing this tradition. It's a very different design tradition, but it's done on the threshold with chalk, with local stone chalk. And it was done by women on the thresholds of their houses in the morning. And it was done, when we have in the West, you have the practice of carrying the bride over the threshold. Part of that practice had these ephemeral ritual art designs at its base. So that's just interesting to think about, the global nature of this. So I'm just going to show this little video so you have in your mind, you can see, for those of you who are familiar, have seen it, but those who might not have, and it might take a little bit time to load up.
Not for any work, but just to know where he is.
So here is one of the most beautiful kolams that I've ever seen. And what you see also from the Kolam video that one was also a laying out of a matrix of dots. So it could go from like the smallest one, like you see on the very top of this complex one where there's 3 dots across. So then you could go, then it goes n+2. So it's 3 dots, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. And then the column is named by the center line of the symmetrical column. So say it's a 21 dot column, that's because there's 21 dots in the center, and then it goes down to 1, that's what would be named. So, and this particular column, it's called a pulli kolam, which means literally dot, and it's one continuous line around all the dots without crossing over them more than once. And so this is really an interesting, one of the design traditions. You see further behind that, behind hers, you see a connect the dot column, which is much easier to do. So I'm just going to read a little bit excerpts from my book, just to give you the context as well. Even one's own tradition is not one's birthright. It has to be earned, repossessed. The old bards earned it by apprenticing themselves to the masters. One chooses and translates a part of one's past to make it present to oneself and maybe to others. One comes face to face with it, sometimes in faraway places, as I did. And this is a quote from A.K. Ramanujan, who's a brilliant, who passed away in the 90s, a brilliant ancient Tamil translator of landscape poetry, A.K. Ramanujan. So I highly recommend his work. And so what's interesting about this is that women wake up in the old days before dawn. And so the column needed to be finished before the first rays of sunlight hit the front threshold of the house. And I actually, when I started this research in 1985, just kind of quite accidentally, as you'll see, and I went from 87 to 98, I went almost every winter for 6 weeks. And sometimes I would spend 2 years, 1 year, different times, so at least 2 years of 1 year stints. And I found that, until about 92, women were still waking up before sunrise. Once the country opened up to the West in 91, then CNN and, all the TV shows and everything kind of was all night long. And so people got really overwhelmed with the media invasion. And so then people would stay up till 2 in the morning watching films. And so they couldn't get up at 4 in the morning and do the column. So then it got more relaxed about when to do them. So this is what women taught me that columns are made to do. These are the reasons that women say they do the column. They say the column is done to do something beautiful. It's to invite, welcome, and host Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, good luck, wellness, and alertness, to banish, unwelcome, and dehost Mudevi, the goddess of poverty, misery, bad luck, sickness, and laziness, to catch the negative effects of the evil eye, jealousy, and envy of those who intend harm, both those you know and also the envy in your own heart, and strangers. And then it's also done to embody Ganesha, the elephant-headed god or the remover of obstacles. It's to indicate auspiciousness and well-being, to prevent suffering and death. And it also is to play and to compete with one another for the best designs of the morning. And it's also to show one's intimate love for God, to be like the 9th century woman, Saint Andal, who we have on record as the first Tamil woman to make columns in the 8th, 9th century. So it's quite an old tradition. And then I think this is also something that really struck me, to remember and ask for forgiveness to the earth goddess, Bhudevi, for our walking and stepping on her, and then to feed 1,000 souls, and also so much more. So this was something that, just really moved me when I was growing up. But it was through the interest of a man named Ivan Illich, who was a philosopher, and he was writing a book on the philosophy of space and the philosophy of water called H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. So in that book, there was a footnote while he was working on it on ritual space. And so he was having a footnote on the column, and you can see in the talk that footnotes have affected my life deeply. And this is one footnote. So he asked for help with figuring out the column. And he asked me so many questions that I didn't have the answer for 3 hours. And I showed him how to I made a kolam for him in Claremont, where, you know, he was there, we were there for a conference. And the questions just awakened in me like, oh, there's so much to the kolam. It's not just decoration, right? And I guess part of the implications of my work I see is that, you know, especially women's ritual decoration is not limited to just the imagination of beauty. It's also the imagination of so many other layers of knowledge that are embedded within these kinds of ritual designs, whether it's India, whether it's Native American traditions, African religious traditions, etc. So that's what I think really excites me as well. And that's what I try to figure out, what the layers of meaning that are embedded within this sort of rich visual and oral knowledge tradition. What's also interesting about this dot kolam, the puli kolam, is that I also discovered, and I will, and this is especially for your, you know, for our audience here. I have a chapter, and this is related to the earlier speaker called, which is chapter 7, called Embodied Mathematics. And it's really about the body. What I realized all of a sudden is, when I was doing this research, is that in some ways, once I watched in a village where there was no electricity, because I had this feeling that somehow non-electrified village, I would learn something about the kolam that I didn't know before. And when I finally found it, even in 92, 94, it was very hard to find a non-electrified village. I finally found one near Tirunelveli, and women would get up at midnight before these festival days and do kolams for 4 or 5 hours, which was incredible. But I also realized it was pitch dark. There was a kerosene lamp, maybe one, and maybe the next door had a kerosene lamp. And they were making these complicated designs in the dark. And I thought, wait a minute, I was imagining that this was done with sight, with the eye. Then I realized that these designs were done with the body, and the eye was really incidental. And these designs were really traces of the body moving through time and space. So that was very powerful for me. And there was a wonderful man, Dr. C.V. Sheshadri, who really helped me, pushed me to study the mathematics of the kolam. And the things that I learned was, of course, you can see the symmetry. And women also spoke about the symmetry, about the necessity of harmony and the necessity of balance in the kolam. Also, you'll see in later ones, red and white colors. So the red was a symbol of females, and the white was a symbol of males, and it could be blood and semen. You know, some people have hypothesized that, and some women have said that to me as well. And that, why do you do it on the threshold? It was the balance of male and female energies at the threshold that partly the kolam represents, even though it was nearly always done by women. And there's also a wonderful ethnomathematician, if you're interested in pursuing the culture and mathematics, of Marcia Asher. And she says, according to her, that at least 6,000 different cultures have existed during the past 700 years, 7,000 years. And many of these have traditions that involve mathematical principles. And this is a quote from her: "Seeking mathematical ideas that were part of oral traditions most often involves re-examining with a mathematical perspective the work and materials of anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, and cultural historians. In essence, concepts of time and space and order placed upon the natural, supernatural, and social worlds all may involve mathematical ideas. What sets the kolam tradition apart from other cases I've studied," this is Asher speaking, "is that it has contributed directly to an academic endeavor. The intricate figures have entered the realm of computer science. The figures have provided material for illustrating known approaches to the analysis and descriptions of pictures, or array grammars and picture languages, and also have stimulated new approaches of thinking. This makes the kolam tradition a rare and especially interesting case." So let me also, here's my mother at the Smithsonian in 1985. So this was in the outdoor mall. So this was one of the inspirations right after Illich. this opportunity came to the Smithsonian to speak about the kolam. And that's when I realized that there was a lot of interest beyond Indians or Indian Americans or Tamil Americans who'd be interested. Here is also for the Pongal festival. And you see the diversity of patterns, like the boy is standing on a very dense pattern of the kolam. And one of the other principles is infinity. And I will show you another slide that'll help explain that as well. This was, you see, women and girls doing it together. So it's also can be a communal activity as well, because sometimes it could take many hours for many different women. I love this because you can see that it's like bursting out of the household, right? And you see the laughter of the woman carrying her, her cordons for her getting the water from the well or from the kolam, from the water tanks. So here you see a lotus flower that's expanding. And you also see a lot of little kolams. And what women would say is a kolam doesn't like to be alone, just like a human being. So you need to have, the kolam also needs companion kolams. So you have all the little kolams that keeping the main kolam company, which I love because people, speak about themselves in that way. So they're projecting that onto the kolam. What's also interesting about this is a lot of women said to me that part of the reason that you make the kolam every morning is that the kolam is a way to capture for a brief moment in time the infinite, the kolam is imagined as going for infinity in that plane. And so you catch that bit of infinity for that moment in time. But as the women are drawing it, but they're imagining it going forever, which I thought was really beautiful. And many mathematicians have also worked on the concept of infinity in the kolam. So, and as well as fractals as well. So fractals also helps you learn the kolam, because once you see, here's another sort of a half kolam. This is also symmetrical. And here's another one with the bike on top of it. So you see that it's sort of very sacred for a few hours, but then afterwards, people, here's another one that you can see. This is unusual because this has a kata kolam, a square kolam, and this looks like it has architecture of the temples embedded within the center of the kata kolam, and then you have the infinite lotus beyond that, and then you have the tole kolams, the companion kolams there as well. And this is also some trapezoid figure. This is also an architectural template of temples. So this is also interesting. And then this is also the festival of Pongal. This is a competition, an ondal competition of young teenage girls. So it's almost like a track team. There's like a sound that goes off, and you have 1 hour, and there's all kinds of prizes. And these are very popular still, and they're popular in magazines. They're popular in real time as well, all over Tamil Nadu. And you also have figurative kolams. So here's a cow and its calf. And part of that also has to do with, I almost titled this book Drawing Down Desires, because women would talk about that when they woke up in the morning. You have to remember, this was like the first action after you brush your teeth, and you're rising from the marital bed into making the kolam. And so the idea was that you're sort of still kind of half in dream time. And so you are projecting, you're drawing your desires. So sometimes people will put pots and pans tucked into the kolams. And the idea is that the women's blessings through her hands will touch the feet of the passers-by and pass on the power of her blessings. Here's a Swiss girl with snowshoes. Of course, Tamil Nadu is very hot, so being cool is also very important. So you desire coolness. So even if people haven't seen snow, they'll draw the snow. And this is a wonderful temple mahout and temple elephant and mahouts that I fell in love with, and hung out quite a lot at the Tanjore temple, and became very fascinated by the relationship of the bindi, the forehead marks, and the kolam, and realized, I have a chapter on this, that the kolam is like the bindi of the household. And here is, like equivalent to feeding 1,000 souls, is rice also scattered. This is in the temple in Chennai. And you see crows feeding off of it. So this is the reason I called the book Feeding 1,000 Souls. Was many women would say to me, you know, the real reason that we do the kolam is to feed 1,000 souls. And at one level that should have been sufficient for me, but I felt like there's something deeper there. And so I really had to search high and dry for why feeding 1,000 souls early in the morning. And I found out that there was, in a 3rd century BCE ancient Sanskrit text, the Dharma Shastras, there was a footnote. And all of a sudden, the footnote gave me an illumination, because what it basically said was, and this really still blows me away every time I speak of it, that the sin in an ancient Hindu customary law and customary practice, that the sin of building a house for yourself was considered so such a huge sin. And the reason was because when you build a house, you are taking up space that was occupied by many, many animals. So you have to make all those animals homeless in order to build your house. And causing that homelessness to all these thousands of creatures that used to have their home there was considered a sin that no matter how good of a human being you were, you could never make up. So the kolam was really done as a small gesture of compensation, of ritual compensation for that deep, grave sin of building your house. So that's one of my last chapters, and that sort of finishes up the book, because I just had never seen that kind of sensitivity to the ecological space around us. So the kolams are made with rice flour, and literally, you know, and I didn't take enough slides of this because it seemed so obvious at the time, but ants would eat the kolam, birds would eat the kolam, earthworms, and there would be little tunnels, like from the, you know, because they were done on the ground, on the earth itself. And so there were little tunnels, you know, from the creatures throughout the morning as they came up and ate the rice flour. Now, of course, in more modern kolams, the meaning of feeding 1,000 souls has been forgotten. And so you have stone ground flour, and you also have plastic stick-on kolams as well. So obviously, you know, if you eat plastic, it could cause death, like we see with the whales and all the animals. So it's you know, the loss of that reason of the kolam's existence, you know, really disturbed me, because the elder women would say, oh, you know, we've forgotten this knowledge. And so that's one of the reasons why I titled the book itself, Feeding 1,000 Souls, just to kind of remind ourselves that the first ritual act of the day should be to feed 1,000 souls every morning. And most humans do not have enough wealth to feed 1,000 human souls, but karmically, in the Hindu karmic, you know, counting system, it was good enough to feed 1,000 animal souls. And I thought that was also interesting in terms of the reciprocal relationship between humans and animals. And this is a beautiful, there's also wet rice flour kolams as well, which last for many months. So this is in the Madurai Meenakshi temple, which I did a lot of research in Tanjavur and Madurai, and I love both of those towns. So this is, and I also wanted to show that, you know, this is one continuous line. This is one of the pulli kolams and one of the complicated ones. And you can see mistakes also, women making mistakes. So it's not perfect, you know, it's a really deep challenge to make these kolams. It's not easy to make them. I always joke that it takes like 6 years from the age of 6 to 12, almost like a PhD, in order to really become a master of this form. But most everybody knows how to do the simple ones. So for just the everyday use. So this is the fractals. So you see like the 3, and then the 3 lines in the middle, and then 1, and then you see 7. This is a 7-line, 7-dot kolam, etc. So you see, once you learn the smaller units, it's much easier to put all the units together. And I have a whole section on that in my book as well. Again, you see, again, this is one continuous line as well. Really stunning. This was one of the most beautiful, I think this was the most beautiful kolam I've ever seen. And this was in Mailadurai, which is also in Tanjavur district. And it's all, again, one continuous line. And this is a 14-year-old girl. And I just happened to go by at 4 in the morning. And it took her about 2 hours to make this kolam. And so I wanted to say, if you wanted to stay in touch with this work or other research projects I'm involved in, you can sign up at my website, feedingathousandSouls.com. And, it's such a delight and honor to be able to share this work today.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vijaya. First question. So which festival do you recommend?
It's called the Pongal Festival, Pongal, and it's the harvest festival that happens in the middle of January. So usually somewhere between January 13th to the 16th. But the height of the kolam making tradition in the annual year is mid-December to mid-January, which is perfect for our winter vacations. But you can see, and women are practicing and they have their kolam notebooks and they're preparing for that time. So that's when you'll see and you'll see a lot of kolam competitions. And so, I think those are also very exciting to go to.
Yeah. That's the perfect season to go to India. I went to
Yes.
India once in our spring, and my photographs are all blurred because I couldn't physically take the picture. I had sweat coming down nonstop, so it gets too hot for us after that. You have a question in the QA. You want to take that question first? Then I have a question for you. Let's take. If you scroll to the bottom.
Okay, let me stop the share and then go to the questions.
The very bottom.
It's not updating for some reason.
Okay, I'll read it for you. Does the speaker have any? No, sorry. This is the first.
Oh, now I see it. Okay, now I see it.
I had the same problem.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, somebody asked, they seem to be meditative in quality, although the first was seen to be done rapidly. Is this the case? I searched for that answer. And when I ask women, was it a part of their meditation, they kind of look at me puzzled, like, that's a question that doesn't apply to us, And so it seems meditative. And I think it's more like a prayer, and I think of it also as a kind of combination between prayer and sort of a female yoga, because the Surya Namaskaram, as most people know, it's like one of the first yoga posture set that you do. And in most cases, it was a male practice, although there were many yoginis as well, but it was primarily yoga was a male practice. And so I could sort of imagine, the sort of homologous duality of, in a household, a man doing the Surya Namaskaram and the women doing the kolam as their Surya Namaskaram, as their kind of yoga. Pongal is Pongal. Yep, that's what it is. And then the next question is, should the casual viewer think of these kolam works as similar to Buddhist mandala practice, or are these two similar things more different in intention and meaning than they are the same? Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the interesting thing to me with the Buddhist mandala practice, especially the Tibetan Buddhist monks doing it, and the Navajo sand painters, are their male traditions, right? So the first difference is that it's a gender difference. And I think the Buddhist mandala practice is much more intentionally as meditative. And of course, the ephemeral nature of them is there, right? But also the Navajo sand paintings are done for more health and healing of the body when there's illness. I think that the kolam has some characteristics that overlap with the mandala practice, but I think I haven't done deep research into the Tibetan mandala practice, but like the kolam, because I know it better, is that there's so many layers to it. For example, if you don't see a kolam in the front of the threshold of a house, it often means that there might have been a death in the family that night before, especially before, emails and before we had, fast communication. People would look at the kolam to see if all has gone well over the night in that household. And if it hasn't, if the woman did not have the capacity to make the kolam, then that meant that she was the household was in the state of receiving hospitality and receiving food. So women would come and bring food to that household. because the capacity to cook wasn't there. That also happens if the woman is having her period. And so, but if, there is a kolam, and you can tell by the nature of the kolam as well, how much time a woman has on her hands and whether she has a sense of abundance of time. So a wandering beggar might look at the kolam and say, aha, there's a big kolam there. This household is in the state of giving. And so I see it as a kind of ritual of generosity. The capacity to express generosity is in that household today. So beggars will come and be able to beg in that household, and knowing that there will be food for them. So I guess, with the Tibetan mandala practice, because it's not every day, it's not done on the thresholds, it has, I think, overlapping sets of meanings, but also different than the kolam, distinctive from the kolam.
Okay, now I'll ask a question, because I had a similar question. Now I have to make it a little bigger, otherwise it sounds like I'm just plagiarizing Rishi. So what I actually own a little booklet that I found once in Myanmar, and it was done by Buddhist monk, and it had all these strange diagrams. Finally, one day I met somebody from Myanmar who spoke English, and I asked him, what does it say? And he told me nothing, they're just drawings. But it was very similar to some of the columns that you showed. So my question was along the same lines, is there some kind of connection? On top of that, I have visited Jain sanctuaries in India, especially Palitana, but also I was thinking of a different one, but I can't remember the name right now. It's also in Gujarat. And the sculpture, not the painting, but the sculpture, that very intricate sculpture also reminds me a little bit. So anyway, so do you see a theme there that propagates through India, or is this just coincidence?
It's interesting that even the linguistic terms for all these patterns are very distinctive. Like the kolam, next door is mugu, then you have rangoli, which means color, which usually, columns don't have, although they could have natural powders in the old days. And now they have more modern powders. And then mandana in Rajasthan and alpana, so, I had conceptualized this project as an all India project. But once I got into the kolam, I was like, wow, this is going to take me one of my lifetimes to do this work. And so I think, the connections are, as I said to Rishi as well, is that it's not obvious. It's not that there's any kind of line of transmission. I think one of the categories of commonality would be the concept of mandala, the concept of auspiciousness, or mangalam, And so I think there's a sense of auspiciousness that's associated with all these kind of ritual designs. And so I think this is also interesting, this question of, sorry, if you had a further question, Piero.
I have, but go ahead with the read. I also see my wife posted the question, so she has priority.
Oh, that's good. So Adelaide Naya asked, Navajo women do also create sand paintings for ritual purposes. I've seen this done. That's great. So kind of as a medicine woman. So I think that's wonderful to see and know about as well. And I think, another one is, how do they learn how to draw it? It's really there's no schools for studying the kolam. It's really done through transmission, oral transmission, and kind of happen chance, like a household act, like how you learn to cook, the child asks questions. But once I noticed, I was upstairs in an upstairs flat in Madurai, and I was watching a grandmother do the kolam, and her granddaughter was visiting from Bangalore. She was like 2.5 years old. And she says to her grandmother, she says, Pati, which is a word for grandmother in Tamil, she says, when you come to visit us in Bangalore, you make way better kolams than you are doing here. How come you're doing such terrible kolams? So I thought, here's a distinction that a 2.5-year-old is able to make between really good, beautiful kolams versus terrible kolams. And the Pati answered, she said, I have a lot more work here. And whereas in Bangalore, I'm a guest in your household, so I have a lot more time, so I can make much more beautiful kolams. And so I think learning how to draw, it's really by watching, and then slowly, Like the first columns will be very messy, like just a bunch of rice flour glumped on the ground, and it won't even look like a column. And then slowly, the girls will practice in their column notebooks and get their dexterity of their hands, on the page, and then it goes onto the ground. And in the ground, you saw that was not speeded up, the video, that was actual speed. So that's where I want to show, like, there's not a lot of deliberation when you're actually making it. So it is like a dance. It is like a embodied choreography. So the body is very much a part of this training. Yeah.
Okay, we left out the men. So what do the men? How do the men fit in the column? Do men, boys draw sometimes, or they're just forbidden?
It's interesting. In the column, when I started watching a lot of column competitions, and in the column competitions, because they were more in modern contexts like museums or there was a men's section that started growing because men also got into the column outside of the ritual context, but in the competitive context. And there was all these debates about aesthetics, because men would draw like in the figurative tradition, more like paintings. And then there was one, I remember there was a Pongal column done by a man or a group of men even, I think, that was of the bullfight, because that's also part of the Pongal festival, and blood coming out of the human that the bull had hit. And so, women who were the judges were like, that's not a column, that's just a painting, So there's that part of it. And then there's also, I interviewed a Muslim teenage boy who loved the column and who were also very active in the competitions. So even though he was Muslim, he hid it from his grandmother, but his mother would let him compete in the competitions. And then traditionally, men did make the columns, but they made it in secret. They wouldn't do it in public. And they did it as part of the ritual context of a Vedic fire ritual. So if you were to watch the hours before a fire ritual actually takes place, which is 1300 BCE, we have evidence of these fire rituals. And so in order to create a sacred space, if they could get women to make that space, they would have women create the space before the fire altar is created. But a lot of times they couldn't, women were busy doing their own things. So the priest would actually make the columns underneath the fire ritual as the first stage, the first layer of sacrality that is created with the design itself. You clean the space, and then you put the design, and then the design is erased, of course, as the brick is laid on in the layers for the Vedic fire ritual.
I imagine, like every tradition, the tradition of the column is probably declining with the younger generations. Is that correct?
Yes and no, because I think in a certain ritual sense, yes. But I would say in terms of an aesthetic tradition, as an aesthetic sense, there's actually a deep delight in the column, because after all, it's ritual play, right? And so I think, even one strips down all the other metaphoric, literal meanings and poetic meanings, the beauty of the column is, it's very charismatic for girls and women to partake in. And then even if they don't participate from the rest of the year, but mid-December to mid-January, most women will be making the column in Tamil Nadu.
Isn't the column more appropriate for the traditional rural setting? A girl who moves into a high-rise building in a big city probably doesn't feel comfortable doing a column anymore.
That's
right?
where you do that's where you have the plastic stick-on column. That's where you often see that, yeah, which is harder to take off because you're supposed to make it for every festival. I should also mention that if you think about Deepavali, you think about the rangolis that are done in Deepavali and all the different parallel ritual traditions that are done on special occasions, it's almost as if hundreds of millions of Hindu women do this kind of ritual design at some point during the calendric year. So it's actually quite a wide, it's necessary, just like you have the fireworks in Deepavali, it's important to do the rangoli as well as a part of the ritual. So I would say for those specific rituals, it's an essential part. You know, what's distinctive about the kolam in Tamil Nadu is it's done every day. And you can make a 30-second kolam. There's also instant kolams where you have like cookie cutters. You can make them in 5 seconds.
A final
Yeah.
question: do you think that the Kolam actually helps children learn mathematics, makes their their mind more open to learning mathematical concepts? Is that possible?
That's a great question. And in fact, there's a whole slew, it didn't make it into the book, but I have a box of materials of educators over the last 30 years who've been using the column for that exact reason, to teach mathematics. And you have, there's an amazing scholar, George Joseph, who's written a book called The Crest of the Peacock. It's by Penguin, came out a couple of decades ago. And it's the history of the roots of non-Western mathematics within Western mathematics. And so that he also, like through Africa, among African Americans and many different groups of people who may not have been trained in Western mathematics, they found that using these traditional ritual aesthetics that have an embodied mathematics, it makes it much easier to learn the mathematical concepts. So that's a whole book in of itself, in terms of, there's hundreds and hundreds of articles about that. In fact, I think I even saw a textbook, a mathematics textbook, and I never could trace it again, but in California, there was a section on the column, on fractals and on array grammars and mathematical concepts. So that's definitely, I also looked in Cambridge. I was curious whether Ramanujan, the mathematician, had mentioned the column in his notebooks. And so I thought, God, wouldn't that be cool if Ramanujan had actually mentioned the column from his mother? But I couldn't find any, but I didn't have a lot of time. I just had a few days. But somebody who's a scholar of, he also looked at infinity, right? An infinite series. So that was kind of interesting to me, that the column is a representation of infinity, and here Ramanujan did some of his most creative work on infinite series. But that's more my hypothesis than any, I don't have evidence for that.
Is anybody keeping that tradition alive here? I mean, we have a lot of immigrants from South India.
We do, yeah. There's kolam competitions in Fremont during Pongal. If you go to any kind of Tamil Sangam Pongal festival, there will be it'll be different because it'll be paper drawn, and hung up on the wall. But then sometimes their audience will give points to each of the designs, and then see who the winners are. And in fact, when I went to different I talk about those competitions in Fremont as well in my book. Because this work sort of started out in a way in the diaspora, went to India, and then I came back to the diaspora as I raised my kids. I would take them to these Tamil Kolam competitions. Yeah, so very much so. Yeah, again, not as necessarily everyday practice, but it's interesting, Pierre, because people always ask me, do I make the kolam every morning? Do my kids make the kolam every morning? No, but because I see it as a language of symbols, and so if it's a language, who's there to understand your language? You don't speak a language by yourself. You speak a language in a community, right? And the kolam is a language that's expressed in the waves of community. But when I saw, after Kamala Harris's victory, that the kolam is becoming known for the first time, I have chills as I say this. For the first time, I thought, if I did a kolam on the threshold of my house in Berkeley, maybe people would understand what it meant. As celebration, as a celebration of luck, or because of this Kamala Harris's ancestral village doing the kolam.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. By the way, I didn't say it at the beginning, but I think tonight we were competing with Kamala Harris. I think.
Oh, really?
many of my friends didn't listen to us because they were listening to the interview live. I think I just saw a few emails about that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
yeah.
People who could not see it live, they can see the video. I will post the video in a couple of days. This was very interesting. Miriam, if you're still there, I also want to say thank you to you And thank you to all the people who listen to us despite the competition from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Thank you. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Kara.
you.
Thanks. Lovely talk.
Thank you, Miriam. Yours was lovely as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye.